With all of the talk of a negotiated ceasefire in Ukraine bringing an end to the full-scale Russian invasion, it's easy to believe that peace is just around the corner. But history suggests otherwise. Because, as we'll see, for over a century, Russian ceasefires have rarely meant the end of hostilities. They've meant a pause. A chance to consolidate, rebuild, and prepare for the next battle. So, to understand the present, let's take a step back and look at the past. Let's pull back what's left of the Iron Curtain and revisit Russia's history of strategic pauses, and then ask the important question: what will it take to negotiate a lasting peace this time? Now, although we could saber charge into the era of Peter the Great and Charles XII, today we will start our journey in the trenches of World War I's Eastern Front in 1918. The situation in Russia was dire following the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II in March of 1917. The Bolsheviks had seized power in the October Revolution, and now they were fighting for survival against internal and external enemies. The wave of executions and assassinations that would come to define this area of Soviet history were just starting. And the Russian Civil War was heating up, which would consume the former empire until 1922. Lenin knew that the new Soviet state could not afford to keep fighting World War I while also dealing with counter-revolutions at home. His solution was to negotiate a hasty ceasefire to earn time to consolidate control inside of Russia. This brings us to the fortress of Brest-Litovsk on March 3, 1918, in what is now Belarus, to sit in on the signing of the treaty that would end hostilities between Soviet Russia and the Central Powers. The terms were dramatically lopsided in favor of the Germans, as Lenin's government gave up massive territories, including Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, and parts of Poland, to German control. This was a devastating loss of resources, industry, and population. But World War I was unwinnable, and continued hostilities would be fatal to the young Soviet state. Overnight, Russia's western border was radically redrawn, and the Soviet state was left significantly weakened. The lost territory included approximately 50 million people, a third of the former Russian Empire's agricultural production, and fully half of their industry. But Lenin could see the winds of war blowing against the Germans, and the treaty was signed. So, to the Bolsheviks, the treaty was never really meant to last. They viewed it as a strategic retreat to buy their way out of World War I, and let the Germans have a temporary victory while they played a longer game. Lenin himself told his Bolshevik supporters, "We must close our eyes and wait for the time when we can take back, with interest, everything we have surrendered." He was gambling on the outcome of the war, and using the interim time to assert power at home. And it wouldn't take long for the gamble to pay off. On November 9, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated the German throne, and 2 days later, on the 11th, his decapitated government signed the armistice, admitting defeat in the war. The Treaty of Versailles, which followed on the 28th of June 1919, explicitly nullified Brest-Litovsk. What wasn't explicit was the status of the regions in question. As German forces withdrew, Soviet Russia wasted no time reclaiming the territories it had lost. In 1919 and 1920, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltics, the Caucasus, and Poland were all invaded. And in just a few years, much of the land surrendered in 1918 was back under Soviet control or in the hands of a puppet satellite government. Brest-Litovsk had served its purpose and allowed the Bolsheviks space to withdraw from World War I and strengthen their grip on Russia, while the German war machine ground to a halt on the Western Front. This was the first major instance of what will become a recurring theme in our history of Russian diplomacy: using ceasefires and treaties not as a genuine peace settlement, but as a strategic pause to regroup, rebuild, and rearm for the next battle. Lenin had just written the playbook on Russian negotiations that Putin still reads from today. It says that Russia doesn't accept permanent defeat, only temporary setbacks, foreshadowing exactly how Soviet leaders and later Russian leaders would handle negotiations for the next century. Give a little today, take a lot tomorrow. With Lenin's death in 1924, the Soviet state was left headless, with Stalin and Trotsky vying for control of the state apparatus Lenin had built. Trotsky had been working either with or around Lenin since they had published revolutionary newspapers together in 1902. Although they hadn't always seen eye to eye, Trotsky fully adopted Bolshevism in 1917, becoming Lenin's right-hand man and commander of the Red Army throughout the Russian Civil War. Stalin was the general secretary of the Communist Party, a role that gave him almost unilateral authority to promote, demote, exile, fire, even imprison or execute anyone. In his final writings, Lenin had warned of Stalin's character. Stalin is too rude, and this deficit, although quite tolerable in our midst and in dealings among us communists, becomes intolerable in the office of General Secretary. Therefore, I propose to the comrades to find a way to remove Stalin from that post and appoint another man, who in all respects differs from Stalin only in superiority, namely in being more patient, more loyal, more polite, and more considerate to comrades. This warning was tightly suppressed by Stalin, and those who brought up the final words of Lenin had a habit of disappearing. Where Trotsky operated on populist consent and battlefield competence, behind the scenes, Stalin was building a secretive network within the state apparatus to ensure his rise to power. This quiet coup worked in stages against Trotsky. First, in 1925, he was forced to resign as commander of the armed forces. Then, in 1926, he was removed from his seat on the Politburo, following an attempt to establish an opposition party to Stalin. In 1927, he was expelled permanently from the Communist Party and exiled to the far reaches of the Soviet Union in Kazakhstan, and, in 1929, removed from the USSR entirely. Trotsky would go on writing against Stalin in exile, moving country to country as the Soviet dictator kept him under tight surveillance. The final movement in his concerto would come in Mexico City on August 21, 1940, when Soviet NKVD secret police agent Ramon Mercader stabbed Trotsky in the head with an ice pick. Stalin, for his part, had commenced his Great Purge in 1936, convicting and executing over 1 million Soviet citizens. By 1939, the purge had decimated the officer corps of the Soviet military, and with the Winter War with Finland and World War II right around the corner, this vacuum in military leadership was about to be felt deeply. And that brings us to the next act in our drama of Russian peace treaty tactics, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 23, 1939. Ask not for whom the bell tolls, because in the spring of 1939, it tolls for thee. The Spanish Civil War had just ended. Germans and Italians had supported the nationalist forces of Francisco Franco, sending their Condor Legion to practice the Blitzkrieg tactics that would become so crucial in the coming World War. The Soviets had supported the Republicans, arming the leftist guerrillas with their latest tanks and military advisors to fight the fascist forces and take their own tactical lessons from the battlefield. Even though the Germans and the Soviets had been on opposite sides of the war, they had never come to an actual armed conflict. This proved that they were capable of controlling separate but close-together zones of influence and must have played some role in what happened next. On August 13, 1939, and on Hitler's behalf, Nazi Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop sent messages to Stalin asking for a meeting, and on the 19th, Stalin met with Germany's deputy foreign minister, giving permission for von Ribbentrop's visit to meet with his Soviet counterpart, Vyacheslav Molotov, in Moscow. The German diplomat arrived August 23rd, and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed that night. To the public, the pact promised non-aggression between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany for a period of 10 years. But in secret, it gave both states permission to invade their neighbors without interference from one another. Both Hitler and Stalin knew that there would be no decade of peace between Germany and the USSR, but it was a play for time that both dictators would need to consolidate their future gains. A week after the pact was signed, on September 1st, 1939, the Germans plowed into Poland in a quick invasion. The Soviets attacked from the north on the 17th, and by October 6th of that year, Poland was no more. Stalin wasn't expecting an honest negotiation. He was taking a gamble, like Lenin gambling on the outcome of World War I. He thought he could outplay the Nazis, carve up Europe, and buy himself some time to consolidate the Baltics and strengthen the Red Army. But the damage had already been done. As we will soon see, he had purged his best officers, ignored intelligence reports, and put the Red Army at a serious disadvantage when Operation Barbarossa came crashing down on June 22, 1941. When Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, Stalin kept himself secluded for days. The Red Army collapsed in retreat, and within months, Poland, the Baltics, and Ukraine were all under Nazi control. In his bid for power, Stalin had come out the loser and would need to forge new alliances to stop the Axis threat. Now let's check back at what the Soviets did in the meantime between the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the launch of Barbarossa. For Stalin, peace with Germany meant war with anyone else. On November 26th, the Soviets staged a false flag operation, shelling the village of Moynila and killing 4 of their own men. Take a moment and remember this point, because we are just getting started on Russian false flag attacks. Stalin blamed the attack on Finland, and on November 30th, 1939, the Red Army, with 450,000 troops, 6,000 tanks, and 3,800 aircraft, crossed the border, expecting to quickly overwhelm the smaller Finnish army. The resistance they encountered, both from men and the environment they were fighting over, would expose the truth about the Soviets. That corruption and the purge had turned the Red Army into a paper tiger. And what should have been a short march through Finland, a special military operation if you will, quickly turned into a bloodbath in the unhospitable northern forests. And that brings us to the third item in our top 10 Russian negotiations, the Moscow Peace Treaty of 1940. The Winter War wasn't going well for the Soviets. Between December of 1939 and February of 1940, the Red Army would commit over 1 million men to the invasion. They found themselves virtually leaderless in a frozen wilderness slaughterhouse, where food and ammunition were scarce and men froze to death at their posts. In just a few short months, they had lost 126,000 men, and 188,000 were wounded. The cracks were really starting to show in the Soviet military. Reminiscent of the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Finns only had a force of 250,000, yet were still able to stop a million-man Soviet army in its tracks, resorting to guerrilla tactics and annihilating entire divisions. On February 1st, Stalin had lost patience with the progress of his army and launched the largest offensive of the war. The Soviets started making limited, bloody gains. Just days later, on the 12th, he sent Soviet diplomat Andrei Zhdanov to Finnish officials with an offer to negotiate. It must have been accepted because a second formal offer followed on the 17th through Sweden. On the 29th of February, Finland's system of defensive fortifications, the Mannerheim Line, collapsed under the sheer weight of the classic Russian meat wave assault. The Finns fought on bravely, but with ammunition and supplies dwindling, they must have known their resistance couldn't last. On March 6th, a Finnish delegation led by future President Juho Kasti Paasikivi arrived in Moscow to negotiate peace. The Finns were met by Vyacheslav Molotov and Andrei Zhdanov, and over about a week tried to negotiate better terms for the treaty, but were stonewalled at every attempt by the Soviets. Molotov and Zhdanov had predetermined territorial concessions for Finland and would not deviate from them. The ultimatum seemed to be that the Finns either capitulate, or Stalin was willing to send 1 million more men to follow his 126,000 casualties from the Winter War. On March 12, 1940, the treaty was signed. Finland escaped with its sovereignty, but was forced to hand over 11% of its territory, including the important transportation and industrial hub of Vyborg, along with the rest of the Karelian Isthmus. Part of the Arctic coast and the strategically important region of Salla were also given up. Over 400,000 Finns were displaced and abandoned their homes to the Soviets rather than live under their rule. Stalin also demanded a 30-year lease on the Hanko Peninsula, which placed Soviet military bases within 80 miles of Helsinki. As a side effect of the partitioning, Finnish rail lines no longer connected, which would hamper military logistics if another war were to come. Finland lost its strategic terrain and buffer territory against the Soviets, but at least it was still a real place. The Soviets got their land and built fortifications, looking forward to the future. Because, in true Russian fashion, this wasn't meant to be a lasting peace. It was just a short break to rearm and refocus. The Finns went back to lick their wounds and would retake most of the land lost in the 1941-1942 continuation war, armed with German equipment. The Germans pushed them to join Operation Barbarossa and advance towards Leningrad. But the Finns refused and played a support role in the operation instead. The lines around Karelia would remain static for the next few years, as the Soviets' attention turned to the Eastern Front with Germany. In June 1944, the Soviets launched the Vyborg-Petrozavodsk offensive, pushing 450,000 men and 10,000 tanks across the reclaimed border into Finland. 2 weeks later, Vyborg fell, and by the end of July, Finnish resistance was on the verge of collapsing entirely. Seeing the tides shifting for their ally Germany, they signed a new armistice with the Soviets on September 19th that was even harsher than the first. Now, let's sit down with Allied leadership and check out the end of World War II and the Yalta and Potsdam conferences to withdraw the world map. In the February 1945 Yalta Conference, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin meant to decide the fate of post-war Europe. Roosevelt and Churchill, still wary of Russian territorial ambitions, pushed for democratic elections throughout liberated Eastern Europe, while Stalin agreed and signed whatever they put in front of him, fully intending to ignore the terms later. By the time of the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, the war in Europe was over. Roosevelt was dead, and Churchill had been replaced as prime minister by Clement Attlee. Although Churchill and Attlee shared concerns over Stalin's ambitions, the new faces across the table were a welcome change for Stalin, who pushed hard for Soviet interests. No matter what he agreed to, Stalin knew that the Red Army wasn't leaving Eastern Europe. The free elections promised at Yalta for Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria would be totalitarian puppet shows designed to create the Eastern Bloc surrounding the Soviet Union. Germany would be cut in half between the East and the West. Stalin played along just enough to get what he wanted. Yalta and Potsdam weren't peace talks. They were just another Russian lullaby, designed to placate the West. Moscow's true intentions were revealed early on, though, when in June of 1948, the Red Army blockaded West Berlin in an attempt to starve the city into submission. This led to the famous Berlin airlifts, where American and British cargo planes dropped supplies to the besieged city. With World War II over and the Iron Curtain firmly in place, the Soviets were ready to face the West on a global scale through their proxies. And they wouldn't have long to wait. By 1950, the Cold War was barely 5 years old, and already Stalin saw an opportunity to expand the Soviet sphere of influence. Eastern Europe was locked down behind the Iron Curtain. Communists had taken over in China, and on August 29, 1949, the Soviets had successfully detonated their first nuclear weapon. The balance of power was shifting, and the Soviets saw an opportunity in Kim Il-sung, the communist dictator of North Korea. North Korea, at the time, was a militarized, totalitarian puppet state, created in 1945 by the hasty agreement to divide Korea between US forces in the south and Soviet forces in the north. This partition was an attempt to avoid confrontation at the end of World War II and not meant to create two permanent states. At the end of the war, most US forces returned home, while the Red Army stayed to train and arm the North Koreans. Kim wanted to unify the Korean peninsula under communist control, but he needed Stalin's support. On June 25, 1950, 135,000 North Koreans, trained and equipped by the Soviets, poured across the 38th parallel, overwhelming the South Korean forces. 3 days later, on the 28th, Seoul had been captured, and the South Koreans and US garrison forces made a hasty retreat. This seemed like an easy win for Stalin, but again, he had misjudged his opponent. Instead of backing down, the United States and its allies intervened in the first ever deployment of forces authorized by the United Nations. A massive counteroffensive was launched by General Douglas MacArthur, and on September 29, 1950, Seoul was recaptured. US and South Korean forces pushed the North Koreans back towards the Yalu River on the Chinese border. But Stalin wasn't done exerting his influence, and pressured Mao Zedong to invade Korea with a massive force of 300,000 men on October 19th. The war turned into a brutal attrition slugfest, with massive casualties. Both sides stalled out around the 30th parallel, and for Stalin, this was the perfect outcome. He had bled the West, draining valuable US resources, and strengthened the communist presence in Asia, all without risking Soviet troops. The war dragged on until the 27th of July, 1953, when an armistice was signed establishing a demilitarized zone not far from the original border the North Koreans had crossed. North Korea to this day is a military dictatorship led by Kim Il-sung's grandson, Kim Jong-un, frozen inside of the Cold War and propped up by Russia and China. Putin and Kim have a ridiculous video driving a car together, and North Korea has sent military aid and soldiers in the thousands to aid the Russian war effort in Ukraine. When Stalin negotiated peace in 1953, it wasn't for the sake of peace. It was to create a belligerent satellite in Asia that would be by Russia's side for generations to come. We can skim over the Vietnam War here, where the Soviets used the Paris Peace Accords to ensure American withdrawal from South Vietnam in 1973, before the Soviet-backed North Vietnamese overran the entire country in the massive Ho Chi Minh Campaign in 1975. We can also quickly glance at the Russian invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, where the Soviets backed the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan in a coup and which turned into a brutal 10-year campaign. 15,000 Soviet soldiers died. That war ended on paper with the Geneva Peace Accords in 1988, and the Soviets left the communist Afghani government to fall into the Mujahideen a couple years later in 1992, a year after the Soviet Union officially closed for business in 1991. Now, relax your body, open your mind, and pay attention, because this era is the pivotal point in the story, and everything moving forward is based on this. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 led to a series of negotiations over the future of Germany, the future of Europe, and Russia's relationship with the West. The moment the wall came down on November 9, 1989, everyone knew reunification was inevitable. On December 3rd, Mikhail Gorbachev met with US President George H.W. Bush in Malta and discussed the coming end of the Cold War and that the Soviet Union would not interfere with the democracy movements happening in its satellite states. Poland had held free elections for the first time in June. Hungary had opened the border to Austria, and the Velvet Revolution was underway in Czechoslovakia. The writing was on the Berlin Wall, and negotiations were hastily scheduled. The deal that followed became known as the 2+4 Agreement. It is named for the two Germanys, East and West, plus the four Allied powers from World War II, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union. The negotiators had 5 meetings from May to September to establish a unified Germany firmly in the Western sphere of influence, in exchange for the promise not to station nuclear weapons or build new bases in the former East Germany. The Soviets would withdraw all 400,000 of their troops, and Germany would recognize its post-war border with Poland. The treaty on the final settlement with respect to Germany was signed in Moscow on September 12, 1990, and just like that, Germany was back on the map. One thing that wasn't on the treaty, though, was any mention of westward NATO expansion. And that's where the lie begins. In February 1990, before the reunification talks started, U.S. Secretary of State James Baker met with Mikhail Gorbachev in Moscow. During their meeting, Baker had said that if the Soviets allowed Germany to reunify inside of NATO, the alliance would not expand 1 inch eastward. That was it. An idea brought up in days of diplomatic conversations, months before a negotiation began. But decades later, this would become the foundation of Russia's claim that NATO betrayed them and the justification for over half a dozen wars. Baker's remarks were never written into a treaty, never included in the final agreement, and never recorded in any official document. The conversation never came up at the 5 meetings on German reunification. And even Gorbachev admitted years later that the NATO expansion was never actually negotiated. The subject wasn't a focus of the later New Union Treaty either, even though that treaty was interrupted by a failed coup. The Soviets were losing control of their former republics, and on March 31st, 1991, a massive crowd turned out in Georgia to vote on an independence referendum with 98% support for leaving the Soviet Union. On December 8th, 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met and signed the Belovezha Accords, declaring that the Soviet Union had ceased to exist and announced the formation of the Commonwealth of Independent States. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, so did Russia's sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. The former satellite states, like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, didn't want to wait and see if Moscow would regain its strength and try to take back territory. They wanted out, along with strong guarantees against future Russian control. So they asked to join NATO. And NATO, with no legal barrier, let them in. By 1999, Poland, Hungary, and what was now Czechia were in NATO. By 2004, the alliance had expanded again to include Slovakia and the former Soviet republics of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And suddenly, from a Russian perspective, NATO was sitting right on their border, even though James Baker mentioned that they might not be 35 years ago. So that moment, in February 1990, defined the next 30 years of Russian warfare. Several military operations, from the 2008 war in Georgia, to the 2014 invasion of Crimea, to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, is justified with the claim that James Baker lied to Mikhail Gorbachev in 1990. It doesn't matter that there was no treaty. It doesn't matter that Eastern European countries chose to join NATO because they feared returning to Russia. The only thing that matters is that Moscow sells the narrative. Because if every time NATO gains a member, it is crossing some self-imposed red line to Russia, and every invasion becomes an act of self-defense. And NATO wasn't the only thing Russia was worried about. While Russia was losing influence over its satellites, new opponents were beginning to form inside of Russia itself. In the Caucasus, a small republic called Chechnya was about to learn that just because you sign a ceasefire with Moscow, the war isn't necessarily over. On November 1st, 1991, Dzhokhar Dudayev, a former Soviet Air Force general, declared Chechen independence. No negotiations, just the bold announcement that Chechnya was no longer taking orders from Russia. For 3 years, Moscow did nothing. Yeltsin and his new Russian government had too much on their plate. The economy was imploding, the ruble was worthless, and he was barely holding Russia itself together. Meanwhile, Chechnya was flying its own flag, ignoring Russia and acting like an independent state. While Chadayev controlled Grozny, in the countryside, warlords, smugglers, and militia leaders ran their own fiefdoms. They fought each other, kidnapped foreigners, and made Chechnya one of the most lawless places on earth. One leader who will come up again is Ahmed Kadyrov, Chechnya's top Islamic cleric. He supported Chadayev and a free Chechen state, for now even issuing a fatwa against Russian occupation. But by the end of 1994, Moscow wasn't ignoring Chechnya anymore. With other former Soviet republics like Tatarstan and Dagestan watching, and an election coming up in 1996, Yeltsin needed to project strength. So he decided that now was the time to reassert Russian dominance on the rogue Chechens. On December 11, 1994, Yeltsin deployed 40,000 Russian troops into Chechnya to seize Grozny and crush Chadayev's independence movement. In a grim foreshadowing of the wars to come, what Russia expected to be a 2 to 5 day push into the capital turned into a 2-year-long military disaster. The Chechens resorted to guerrilla tactics and turned Grozny into a death trap. Russian tanks were trapped and immobilized in the wrecked urban hellscape, while snipers and mines waited somewhere out of sight around every corner. The Russian invaders suffered between 2,000 and 5,000 casualties in the first weeks alone, and, when they were unable to take the city, resorted to mass shelling and area bombings. On New Year's Eve 1994, the Russians launched a massive offensive into the city, where they were pinned down on the streets and slaughtered, taking over 2,000 casualties in the assault. By March, the Russians had nominal control over what was left of Grozny, but the fighting moved into the countryside and the war dragged on for 2 more years, costing around 25,000 Russian and 10 to 15,000 separatist lives. The war wasn't kind to the civilian population either. According to Human Rights Watch, Russian shelling and bombing campaigns, not to mention massacres and executions, had cost 50,000 civilian lives. In April of 1996, Chadayev was killed in an airstrike when his satellite phone was hacked. In August of 1996, separatists infiltrated Grozny and retook the city, and Yeltsin knew it was time to cut a deal. What resulted were the Kosovyurt Accords, negotiated between Russian General Alexander Lebed and Aslan Maskhadov, a popular Chechen military leader whose name we should remember for later. The accords were straightforward. Russia agreed to withdraw all troops by December 1996, and that Chechnya would remain independent for now, with its final destiny to be decided through a referendum in 2001. Unfortunately for independence-minded Chechens, Russians would be back before then to make sure the referendum never happened. Aslan Maskhadov won Chechnya's only democratic election in 1997 with 59% of the vote. Vladimir Putin was appointed prime minister by President Boris Yeltsin in August of 1999, just weeks before a string of 5 apartment bombings ripped through the Russian Federation, killing nearly 300 people. Even though the attacks were carried out with hexogen, a powerful military explosive, the government blamed the bombings on Chechen terrorists. But on September 22nd, bystanders saw 3 men planting explosives on a building in the city of Ryazan. The bomb was safely deactivated and the men were arrested, but when the terrorist identities were revealed, they weren't Chechens. They were FSB intelligence agents. And the bomb they were preparing? Hexogen. The government quickly declared the attempted bombing a training exercise, blaming Chechnya for the other 4 bombings, and invaded for the second time on September 30th, 1999. It was Putin's first major decision as prime minister, and he wasn't going to let Russia's second foray into Chechnya unravel like the first. Instead of rolling into Grozny like the first Chechen War, Russia leveled everything. Airstrikes, artillery, and cruise missiles. This wasn't going to be the same urban battlefield as last time. The Russians wanted nothing left by the time they got there and bombed the city for months before attempting to move in, blasting whole neighborhoods off the map. By November, the siege had begun. Then, in December of 1999, Russia issued its ultimatum: leave the city or die. But the citizens had nowhere to go. The roads were mined, the escape routes were blocked, and Russian artillery was targeting anything that moved on the roads. Aslan Maskhadov, who by now was the president of Chechnya, fled into the mountains and continued to lead from there. He offered ceasefires and tried to negotiate, but his overtures were ignored by Putin. Ahmed Kadyrov, on the other hand, had betrayed the separatists and was now supporting Putin's invasion. The final battle for Grozny lasted until February 6, 2000. But by then, all that remained was a pile of rubble, a city-sized mass grave. The United Nations later called Grozny the most destroyed city on Earth. And this was Putin's message to the world. Russia was back in control of Chechnya, and this time they weren't leaving. Putin installed Ahmed Kadyrov as Chechen's leader and offering Kadyrov absolute power as long as he served Moscow. When he was assassinated by his former Chechen allies in 2004, his son, Ramzan Kadyrov, took over. I could talk for a while about Ramzan, but it would be better to show you than to tell you, so I'll just drop this link here. Aslan Maskhadov was assassinated by Russian special forces on March 8, 2005, further cementing Ramzan Kadyrov's rule. The Second Chechen War officially ended in 2009, but really the insurgency is ongoing. Chechnya was turned into a police state, ruled by Kadyrov's private army, a force that would later be deployed in Syria, Ukraine, and anywhere else Russia fights. Separatist veterans from both Chechen wars scattered across the Caucasus Mountains, keeping the fight alive. Currently, there are many free Chechen units fighting in Ukraine against the hated Russians and their Kadyrov allies. The first war was an abject failure, but Putin made sure that the second war wouldn't follow the same script. This time, in addition to destroying Chechnya, he made sure to rebuild it to suit his expansionist designs. As the action in Chechnya was slowing down, in Georgia, it was speeding up. In the early 1990s, as the Soviet Union fell apart, Georgia had voted to become an independent nation, and had distanced itself from Russian influence. However, in the regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, there had been conflict since the 1991 referendum on independence. These areas had significant ethnic minorities who sought autonomy from Georgia. Russia provided support to these separatist movements from the beginning of Georgian independence, aiming to both destabilize its neighbor and maintain influence in the Caucasus. The conflict in South Ossetia ended on paper in 1992 with a ceasefire, but allowed Russian peacekeepers to maintain a presence in the region. In Abkhazia, Russian and Chechen soldiers helped the separatists to expel 250,000 Georgians, and then engaged in a program of ethnic cleansing using murder and rape to exterminate the area's Georgian population. Always good neighbors, Russian peacekeepers were deployed to the region, ensuring that it could never be retaken by Georgia. The early 2000s saw major social and political shifts towards the west. The 2003 Rose Revolution had led to the resignation of Edvard Shevardnadze, who had been president since the elections in 1992, and had worked to maintain good relations with Russia and the West. Around this time, Putin started offering Russian citizenship to Ossetians and Abkhazians. This passportization is a tactic Russia uses to destabilize and confuse territorial claims. But extraterritorial naturalizations are not recognized by international law and do not confer legal citizenship. In 2004, Mikhail Saakashvili was elected president with a massive mandate. His goal was to integrate Georgia into NATO and the European Union. Just the sort of thing that Putin wrongly thinks is any of his goddamn business. Georgia detained 4 Russian military officers in 2006 on espionage charges. In retaliation, Russia imposed economic sanctions, severed transportation links, and deported thousands of ethnic Georgians residing in Russia. Russia has a 2-term presidential limit, so in 2008, Vladimir Putin installed Dmitry Medvedev as president and himself as prime minister. Kosovo declared itself independent of Serbia in February of 2008 and was recognized right away by the West. In April, at the NATO summit in Bucharest, Georgia's aspirations for membership were an important topic, along with Ukraine. The United States delegation supported a membership action plan for both nations. But, unable to reach a consensus, both Georgia and Ukraine left the summit with the promise that they would be NATO members eventually. The lukewarm approval for NATO membership wasn't enough to help Georgia, or for that matter Ukraine, make much progress towards integration. But it did fit the Russian narrative that NATO was encroaching on its borders. This narrative conveniently omits that NATO is an alliance of the willing, or maybe just illustrates a fundamental cultural difference. For Georgia, the summer of 2008 saw worsening tensions in South Ossetia. On August 7th, President Mikhail Saakashvili saw a unilateral ceasefire as a show of good faith to the South Ossetians. The Russian-backed separatists responded by intensifying their shelling of Georgian towns. Then, when Georgian forces launched a large-scale military operation to reclaim control over South Ossetia, Russia's response was sudden and severe. Around 60,000 Russian troops poured into South Ossetia, rapidly advancing into Georgian territory. On August 11th, US President George W. Bush had this to say: "Russia has invaded a sovereign neighboring state and threatens a democratic government elected by its people. Such an action is unacceptable in the 21st century." Bush urged Russia to sign the EU-mediated ceasefire, which happened on the 13th. A finalized version was signed on the 16th by Dmitry Medvedev. The fighting only lasted 5 days, but resulted in significant casualties and civilian displacements. 850 had been killed on all sides, but nearly 200,000 Georgians were forced from their homes by the fighting, many of them never to return. Separatist militias supported by the Russians were accused of ethnic cleansing and human rights violations by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. In the aftermath, Russia recognized the independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia and continued to support the rogue regions, which still seriously hampers Georgia's ambitions for NATO membership, since Article 10 of the NATO Charter says a territorial dispute introduces an immediate security threat to the alliance. This short sequence of events would provide a roadmap for the next Russian invasion. This time, the Russians would use a series of sham independence referendums and masked gunmen with no insignia and a lot of Russian military equipment to carve away parts of eastern Ukraine. But this operation would take a lot longer than 5 days. Before we get into Ukraine in 2013, we need to look at the Bucharest Memorandum of 1994. This is the deal that the Ukrainians made with the US, the UK, and Russia. Ukraine agreed to give up the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world in exchange for the promise from the Russians to respect their territorial integrity and never use military force against Ukraine. This should have been a path to a lasting peace for the region. But as we've learned time and again in this story, Russia has no intention of honoring its agreements with its neighbors. Ukraine in 2013 was on the verge of integration with the West, and President Viktor Yanukovych was set to sign an association agreement with the EU that had been at the negotiation table since 2007. At the last minute, on November 21st, he rejected the deal and took $15 billion from Russia instead. Protests erupted in Kyiv, demanding a European future. Yanukovych sent in riot police, and Russian provocateurs infiltrated the crowds and spilled blood in the streets. This Euro-Maidan movement exploded into a full-scale rebellion. Barricades went up as streets and government buildings were occupied. By January of 2014, Kyiv was a war zone. The worst day was February 20th, 2014, when government snipers opened fire on a crowd, killing over 100 protesters. 2 days later, Yanukovych fled to Russia, and Ukraine was left leaderless. Pro-EU leaders took control, while new elections were scheduled for May, and Ukraine maneuvered back towards the EU deal that had sparked the protests. But the conflict was just getting started. Kyiv was still filled with demonstrators, demanding justice for the over 100 people killed in the Maidan massacre. The security forces were in disarray. Some had fled, some had joined the opposition, and some were loyal to Moscow. The streets became a military fashion show as every new unit had its own uniform, insignia, and mission in the chaos. In eastern Ukraine and Crimea, pro-Russian demonstrators took to the street, calling the new government a coup, waving Russian flags, and demanding independence from Ukraine. Russian media amplified these voices. Ukraine had taken a step towards the West, but Russia wasn't letting it go without a fight. And that's when the little green men appeared. In violation of the 1994 Bucharest Memorandum, and with no flags, insignia, or answers to questions, unmarked soldiers, heavily armed with Russian equipment, seized key sites across Crimea before anyone could react. On February 27, 2014, masked gunmen stormed the Crimean parliament, raising the Russian flag. That same night, the unnamed invaders occupied Simferopol Airport and Belbek Air Base, cutting Crimea off from mainland Ukraine. Within hours, all major government buildings, television stations, and military bases were surrounded or seized. The little green men would show up, take an objective, and then hand it over to the pro-Russian mobs that always seemed to show up where the soldiers were. While this suggested coordination, Moscow, of course, denied everything. Separatist officials called it a local uprising by self-defense forces, while Russian-equipped soldiers rolled into Crimea in Russian armored vehicles, using Russian tactics, and speaking Russian. Moscow dismissed the evidence, calling the anonymous soldiers just concerned locals. In reality, the operation had been in the works for months. Crimea was already flooded with Russian agents, coordinating with the separatists and preparing for the coming occupation. On March 1st, 2014, Putin officially deployed Russian forces into Ukraine, using the disorder that his forces had already created as a pretext to invade. The next day, Crimea's regional parliament, now led by Sergei Aksyonov of the Russian Unity Party, announced a referendum on joining Russia. The outcome was typically Russian. The vote claimed a staggering 97% support for Russian annexation. International observers were banned and Ukrainian voters were intimidated or outright prevented from voting. 2 days later, on March 18th, Putin formally signed Crimea into the Russian Federation in an opulent ceremony in Moscow. The West condemned the move, and the United Nations refused to recognize the annexation. Sanctions were imposed, and on March 24th, Russia was removed from the G8. But the international community didn't make a move to take Crimea back. Russia had just redrawn European borders by force and then got away with it. But while the focus was on Crimea, more separatist protests had begun in eastern Ukraine. Tensions were rising in Donetsk, Luhansk, and Kharkiv, promoted by Russian intelligence operatives and the same Kremlin propaganda machine that had already delivered Crimea. But this time, it wouldn't be a quick occupation. Instead of masked soldiers taking government buildings overnight, Ukraine was about to face years of Russian soldiers, weapons, and atrocities. By the end of April, separatist militias seized key buildings in Donetsk and Luhansk, declaring them independent people's republics. On May 11th, both Donetsk and Luhansk held unrecognized referendums, which, unsurprisingly, showed overwhelming support for independence from Ukraine. Over the summer of 2014, Ukrainian forces retook much of the disputed territory. But on August 24th, a large Russian force deployed to Donetsk Oblast, marking a significant escalation. This incursion was part of a broader offensive that saw Russian regular army units crossing into Ukraine and intensifying the war in the Donbas region. Ukrainian forces collapsed under the assault. By early September, Russian-backed troops had surrounded Ukraine brigades in Ilovaisk, where over 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers were killed or captured as they tried to retreat through the Russian checkpoints. It was a massacre. The Ukrainian government had no choice. The West was offering statements and sanctions, but not weapons or troops. If Ukraine kept fighting, it risked losing even more ground. On September 5th, 2014, representatives from Ukraine, Russia, and the separatists met in Minsk, Belarus, to negotiate a ceasefire. It would be known as Minsk I, the first of 2 attempts to stop the war. But as we've already seen, in Russia, the stop button is broken. But the pause button, that works just fine. The terms of the agreement were that Ukraine would recognize the special status of the Russian-occupied Donetsk and Luhansk, grant amnesty to the separatists, and agree to elections that would, naturally, be held under the barrels of Russian guns. In return, Putin, who still wouldn't admit that Russian troops were in Ukraine, was supposed to pull back his forces and allow monitors from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, to verify the peace. Unsurprisingly, the international monitors were stymied at every opportunity by the separatists, and the violence continued. That brings us to Minsk II, signed on February 12, 2015, just 6 months after the first Minsk agreement. It was everything Russia could have asked for. Another ceasefire to ignore, a withdrawal of heavy weapons that Russia wouldn't admit existed in the first place, and political concessions that would effectively turn Donetsk and Luhansk into Russian-controlled territories inside of Ukraine, permanently destabilizing the country and derailing the project to join NATO. The OSCE, once again, was given the job of monitoring an agreement that was unenforceable. The Russians didn't even wait for the ink to dry before violating the treaty, and just 6 days later, they encircled the city of Debaltseve while Russian diplomats denied involvement. The city fell on February 18th, proving once again to Russia diplomacy is really just another theater of war. Minsk II had turned the war into a frozen conflict, giving Russian control over Ukraine's east as the violence continued. Neither Minsk I nor Minsk II was meant to last. In this conflict, every ceasefire was just another play for time. The front lines in Donbas never truly stabilized. The shelling never fully stopped, and Russia never really pulled back. Instead, they spent nearly a decade after Minsk II infiltrating more of the region with intelligence operatives, weapons, and Russian passports, turning the so-called People's Republics into Russian military outposts. Between Minsk II in 2015 and the start of the full-scale invasion, OSCE monitors from 53 countries stayed in Ukraine recording ceasefire violations. Nearly 5,000 people were killed in that time. In February of 2022, as the full-scale invasion started, the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission evacuated its staff. In the year of the ceasefire leading up to the invasion, they had observed 36,686 explosions, 26,605 projectiles in flight, 491 muzzle flashes, 524 illumination flares, and at least 54,330 bursts and shots. While Ukraine worked to strengthen ties with NATO and the West, Russia was strengthening their justification for the next war. Nazis in Ukraine, controlled by NATO agents, taking what was rightfully Russia's. Putin invokes the 1770s conquest of Catherine the Great and ignores the stacks of treaties signed since the fall of the Soviet Union. I mean, by his calculations, New York is still British. In 2021, Russian troops concentrated on the border with Ukraine increased by 150,000 men, while Russia claimed it was an exercise. In January of 2021, NATO rejected Russian demands that Ukraine not be allowed membership, and that they move NATO forces to pre-1997 positions. With his demands unmet, Vladimir Putin recognized the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics on February 21, 2022, which nullified the Minsk agreements, and on the 24th, the ceasefire ended as the Russian army embarked on their 3-day special military operation.